Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Jonathan Moreno, the David and Lyn Silfen University Emeritus Professor and Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor at the University of Pennsylvania on our podcast. Dr. Moreno also holds professorships in medical ethics and health policy, history and sociology of science, and philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Jonathan Moreno is a leading bioethics and historian of science whose books include Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die, and Mind Wars, Brain Science and the Military in the 21st Century. He previously co-hosted the podcast Making the Call and is the author of numerous influential works such as Impromptu 2, Men, The Body Politic, and Undue Risk, with more than 1,000 scholarly and popular pieces published in translation into multiple languages. A member of the National Academy of Medicine, he has advised US presidential commissions, federal agencies, international bodies, and major foundations, and his commentary appears regularly in top outlets including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and leading science and policy publications. In 2008 and 9, he also served on former US President Barack Obama's transition team, contributing his expertise at the highest level of national policymaking. Professor Moreno holds a PhD in philosophy, an honorary doctorate, several major career awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and has been recognized for his global contributions to bioethics and science policy. In today's episode, Dr. Jonathan Moreno shares key insights from his acclaimed book, Absolutely Essential: Bioethics and the Rule-Based International Order. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Jonathan Moreno to the conversation. Dr. Jonathan, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Well, Deepak, thank you. And I've watched a number of your other interviews, and you're really good. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Professor, you argue that bioethics isn't just a field that operates within the post-World War II liberal order, but is actually a creature of it. Can you walk us through that origin story? How did the Nuremberg Code's assertion that consent is absolutely essential serve as a pillar for the broader geopolitical project of open market and liberal democracy?
So that's an ideal question to get us started. Um, we are now in what you might consider an interregnum period in the international system. For the last 80 plus years, we've been had our international relationships arranged by a set of standards and conventions and rules and indeed international treaties and alliances, multiple kinds of arrangements between states that was put into place after the Second World War by the victorious Allies, in particular led by the United States. Somebody said recently that the Marshall Plan, which the U.S. Was the U.S.'s project to rebuild Europe, was sort of 75% self-interest and 25% idealism, and I think that's about right. So we have to be realistic about this. The system that the United States put into place after World War II, has been very good for the United States. And I would argue it, in many ways, not always, has been good for the rest of the world. Um, the particular event that's relevant to the beginning of the story I tell in Absolutely Essential is a trial of Nazi doctors and medical bureaucrats in 1946 and 1947 in Germany. It was still Germany, not yet West Germany, in Nuremberg. And the reason this event is important is, well, there's a recent film that you might know called Nuremberg about the trial of a Hollywood movie about the trial of the surviving Nazi German generals and admirals and political leaders. The second trial is also quite important. The second trial was a trial of the doctors. Now, why the doctors? Because medicine is the first profession that had its own laws and standards and rules and ethics. So medicine has a special role in the human experience, right? People are vulnerable, and we expect doctors to behave according to a certain moral standard. What the trial addressed was the crimes committed in concentration camps not only in concentration camps, but other crimes against human beings during the Third Reich. A key idea that the International Panel of Judges uh, created as part of their code, what we call the Nuremberg Code, following the trial, is the idea that in order to put somebody in a human in an experiment, a human being into a medical experiment, you have to get their consent. That seems like a really simple idea to us today. I mean, we can you imagine experimenting on somebody without their consent today? It's hard to imagine. If it's your child, the parent would have to give permission. If somebody who doesn't have the capacity to give consent anymore because they have maybe a dementia, somebody who cares about them would have to give permission. It seems so obvious. That was not the case until the Nuremberg Code, which created this sort of global standard. Also, and this is where the title of my book comes from, the judges said that consent is absolutely essential. Now, I argue in the book that what they're talking about is not only absolutely essential for doing human experiments, but absolutely essential as part of the New World Order, of a rules-based order that consists of liberal democratic states with people who are respected and who the consent of the governed is required in those states. So, although we might say, gee, medical ethics, or bioethics, it's kind of a very restricted area. Actually, I think it's very basic to the order that we have observed. As I said, has not always worked well, very many flaws, but it has, at the very least, prevented a third world war, which people were worried about in the late 1940s, um, and it has created a framework of human rights. I gave you a very long answer to a good question, but we are now, and we can talk about this if you like, seeing this system at the very least radically diminished.
Professor, you mentioned that many people view bioethics as an esoteric, niche academic pursuit. Why do you think it has been misunderstood this way for so long? And how does your book reframe it as a central paradigmatic creation of the global political system?
Well, it's easy to see bioethics or medical ethics or biomedical ethics as a very specific area that only comes up, you know, if we ask Deepak to be part of an experiment, God forbid, because you have a serious illness, we'd say, well, we need. There are two things that you would be entitled to, no matter where you live in the world. This is one of the innovations of the post-war order. Uh, no matter where you are in the world, if you're asked to be in an experiment, you are entitled to two things: a prior review of the proposed experiment by a group of people who have some knowledge of the medical field and have no conflict of interest. The second thing that you would be entitled to, as we were just talking about, is your informed consent to be in the experiment. Now, that seems very specific, right? But the presupposition of the whole arrangement that I've just described is that there is something called universal human rights, that all human beings, and this is an idea that comes from Immanuel Kant and John Locke, the 17th, 18th, 19th century philosophers that we know about. Um, this is a very basic idea: universal human equality. But that is not, as they say about the Ten Commandments, that's not written in stone. That's the result of a consensus that human civilization has reached, but only in the last 80 years or so. What I'm claiming is that bioethics may seem very narrow, but it's built on a foundation that is very broad and supposed to be very generalizable to all human beings.
Professor, we are seeing a fracturing of the post-World War II order, rising nationalism, protectionism, and what we have called illiberal democracies. If the political infrastructure that built bioethics is crumbling, does the field of bioethics risk collapsing with it? Or can it exist independent of liberal democracy?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very key question right now. Like you, I talk to a lot of business leaders, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry and the drug and device industry, and they are very concerned about what the standards are going forward for them. I heard one pharmaceutical executive say, we are a science-based company. We are global. We can't function simply based on what people want to believe. We have to go with evidence. And what we're seeing right now is a shift more toward whatever I think is according to my values and not judgments made in accord with evidence. So I know you're mainly a business guy, and this is business talk, not bioethics talk. But what I'm trying to convey here is that the global business community itself, and you may have run across this in talking to leaders for your podcast, the global industry itself, particularly in pharma, but not only pharma, needs to know what the rules are. You know, business does not like to operate without knowing what the red lines are. And right now, I fear those lines are being obscured. So let's just specifically talk about where we could be going forward in pharmaceuticals, in pharmaceutical regulations and approval. And it is possible that even as the rules-based order we're talking about is diminishing, that there will be certain islands in which some of these ideas, like the idea of consent, will be sustainable. Perhaps even while we're facing realignments in the international system and what people have called illiberal democracies, and actually leaders like Prime Minister Orban, and I think American leaders too, are kind of really liking the idea of illiberalism, which is a big shift from 500 years of human civilization, but maybe that's what we're facing. Uh, it may be that consent for drug trials, for example, would be an island in which those values could be sustained. It might be. But think about emerging technologies, right? Where are we going with AI? How do we decide how to train AIs, what the data should be, what the discrimination and bias could be? What are the rules for trustworthy AI? What does it even mean, right? Just to take one example of that still emerging technology, how do we decide what the rules are going forward? Let's say we agree on what the rules are for human experiments. What are the rules for AI experiments going forward? And then we have the overlap, the use of AI in drug development. So a couple of people, one of whom I knew years ago, won the Nobel Prize a few months ago for AI in identifying new molecules that could be useful in drug development. Well, a molecule itself doesn't help us do medicine. It has to be converted into something that is useful that can be put safely into the human body. So we're facing, uh, even if the pharmaceutical world may be sustainable in terms of consent, the AI world emerging, we have to have international partnerships to do that. The Trump administration says we don't care about what the UN is doing about AI. All right, then that puts us in a very awkward position. Not only about AI itself, but also about AI and drug development and approval.
Dr. Moreno, you have drawn parallels between the first Cold War, which shaped early bioethics, and potential second Cold War today. How does the nature of competition today, specifically with China and Russia, differ from the Soviet era in the terms of medical science and ethical norms?
Yeah, there are two things I want to say about the Soviet Union and compared to Russia in science. The Soviet Union was a fairly significant player, as you probably know, in science and engineering, particularly in fields like physics, in genetics. Um, Soviet scientists got Nobel Prizes and major awards. Um, they couldn't compare to the U.S. even in the Soviet era, but still they had a role. Russian science today is not what it was during the Cold War, and that's partly because of a shift in investment toward wartime material in the last 4 or 5 years since the invasion of Ukraine, arguably in the last, since 2014. Um, it's also I think a fact in the case of Russia that there has been some isolation because of sanctions, externally imposed isolation, but also self-isolation. I mean, Russian scientists are not traveling the way Soviet scientists did to the West to conferences. My father was a psychiatrist, and we went to Russia as a family in 1959 so he could lecture, and again in 1966. We call it the Iron Curtain. My historian friends really say it was more like a nylon curtain. People could go back and forth. There's very little of that now. I know at least one Russian scientist at the moment in the U.S. who's trying to get a visa to stay here. That's very complicated right now. So Russia, just to take that example, is not the player that it was. China, of course, is called by American national security authorities the peer competitor. And by one measure, China has just a few months ago exceeded the U.S. in basic science, the one measure being publications in the major journals, what scientists call the one-word journals, Nature, Science, Cell, and so forth. That's not something that is a surprise to people like me. Frankly, I wrote about this in a book called The Body Politic, in 20, I think it was 2010, 2011. We saw this coming. Now, some people will say, oh, well, China does a lot of junk science. Well, maybe they do, but the fact is they still do a lot of good science. And the US, we are deeply integrated with science in China. What the Trump administration is doing right now in trying to, and I'm not saying there are not intellectual property issues. There are issues of IP. There are issues of theft of ideas. There's national security issues with China in the U.S. But still, we are really integrated with China. Your viewers may not know that in the last few days, Congress decided not to include in its new budget a prohibition against American scientists communicating with certain countries. Uh, Interestingly, China is not on the list, right? But in other ways, the Trump administration has been discouraging contact between U.S. scientists and Chinese scientists. Science doesn't work that way. Science is multinational and global, and whether people like it or not, that is the case, and I think that will continue to be the case. But it is not getting easier to do.
Professor, the pandemic was a massive stress test for the rule-based order. Did the global response to COVID-19, characterized by vaccine nationalism and supply chain battles, prove that the international bioethical consequences was weaker than we thought?
Yes, I think what we missed, Deepak, in anticipating something like a global pandemic was the role of national states in deciding what vaccines to buy from what sources and under what circumstances they could be disseminated. Um, I was just having lunch yesterday with a former student who was at the Pan American Health Organization during the pandemic, and she confirmed what other people have said to me that it really very much depended on what country you were in, uh, what vaccine you would get. And what that means is that governments were deciding, political authorities were deciding, from whom to buy which vaccines, and that unfortunately ended up in a lot of corruption and dirty dealing, and that almost certainly resulted in some people not getting the vaccines that they needed, and it certainly resulted in people getting vaccines that were derived from data that was not published. So, that was something that we really failed, I think, to appreciate. The political nature of what you've called vaccine nationalism, and I've called in some papers, the political nature of responding to a pandemic through the corporatization of the development of vaccines and the way that nation states responded. So that's something that we really have to think carefully about as we're planning for what will, inevitably be another pandemic. I mean, human beings have not defeated biology, even though political leaders would like to think so. That's just not the way it's going to work.
Professor, given your work with the Department of Defense and as an official army-made scientist, do you worry that national security interests in a new multipolar world will start to override the universal ethical standards established after 1947? And Are we entering an era where winning in biotech justifies user ethics?
Yeah, that's a big one. Big question. It is true that as kind of a fun thing, I was named an official mad scientist by by a Defense Department, the Strategic Command, after a paper I gave a number of years ago to one of their groups, which is, maybe my favorite line on my resume. Um, Look, I will say that in the U.S., the command and I've met lots of people sort of in NATO allied countries, and by the way, in India and Pakistan as well over the years in the officer corps. Um, I would say that for the professional military officers, the people that I have met at least, take the take the law of armed conflict, which is one product of the rules-based order after World War II, very seriously. It is part of their professional code. Now, and I will say, by the way, recently in the U.S., the challenges to that code of officer conduct, I think, have fallen pretty flat. That most people in the military, certainly the leaders, um, and without naming names, I will say that I've spoken to some people about this, and they are not shifting away from what they believe are to be the ethical codes uh, for the officer corps uh, in the leading countries. Um, Having said that, in the final analysis, you have to win the fight, and so it is a very deft balance between the code of ethics in the military setting and the need to have an advantage over one's adversaries. But that is something that you don't settle by, simply writing a code of ethics or by having one conference or by having one workshop with military leaders. That is an ongoing project. That's something we will have to continue to do.
Professor, your book theorizes new ways to think about bioethics post-pandemic. Could you give us a concrete example of a principle or framework that needs to be retired and what should replace it to meet the realities of 2025 and beyond?
Yeah, so we talked a few minutes ago about consent, and that implies a respect for personal autonomy, critical again in the domain of human experiments. That system of ideas, especially the notion of consent and respect for personal autonomy, came up in a world where the big issues were issues about human experiments, about scandals and tragedies, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. Um, that system of ideas is still absolutely indispensable ethically for human experiments. The problem is that if we start with respect for personal autonomy, we don't capture the public health setting. And I think what we're seeing now, for example, in anti-vaccination campaigns, uh, and some skepticism has always been around, but it's much bigger now, is that the idea of autonomy has been taken as a kind of a flag that people wave. I'm entitled to my autonomy. Don't have to vaccinate my kids. Well, the problem is that if you send your kids to school, they expose my kids. So um, we need to rethink, and I'm engaged in this now with a colleague writing another book. We have to think about a pandemic era bioethics where we retain the idea of personal autonomy, the idea of consent for human experiments, the idea of consent in your conversations with your own doctor about what your regular treatment should be. But we also have to think more carefully about ethics in the setting of a pandemic. Because in the last 80 years or so, we have been blessed not to have a global pandemic. Obviously, there have been horrible epidemics. I lived through the HIV/AIDS, the worst of the HIV/AIDS era. It's not over, but the HIV/AIDS era in the late 80s and the early 90s, before modern therapies, it was terrible. But we have not had this kind of global pandemic the way we had the 1918 flu, for example, right? Which my father lived through. He was born in 1889, and he lived through that flu global pandemic that changed the course of history. We have not had that since 1945, but we did starting, of course, in 2020. So it is time, I think, to take into account a bioethics that is suitable for pandemics and the public health setting in a way that we just haven't really thought about in the last 80 years.
Professor, multilateral organizations like the WHO, key pillars of the order you describe, have faced immense criticism and loss of trust. If these institutions lost their authority, who and what becomes the new arbiter of global bioethical standards?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the WHO has been one of the key organizations in global health for decades. Um, The problem is these international organizations have only as much authority as nation states are willing to give them. And we have, what, 195 nation states in the UN, a couple of observer groups. Uh, you, you can't blame the organization if you set it up to fail. And we have done that, I think, in the case of WHO. So um, if we don't have a system that enables us to be cooperative, because, it's a cliche, but it's true, the bugs don't care about borders. You can draw the black lines around nation states that you want, around territory that you like to draw. The bugs don't care. So, the WHO is one of those organizations that if we don't have it, we'll have to invent it. I think it's a very bad idea to undermine the WHO. The Trump administration has said we're going to withdraw from WHO. That is a very self-defeating move. We should use our power, our financial power, our credibility, diminished though it is with the rest of the world, to change the organization, to improve it, not to undermine it. Because I can guarantee you, and you will be around to see this. I might not be, but if there's another global pandemic, we're going to have to rebuild something like the World Health Organization.
Professor, the original rules-based order focused heavily on states. Today, massive biotech and AI companies often have more power than nations. Does Absolutely Essential offer a roadmap for now bioethics should govern private entities that operate outside traditional state-based rules?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about recently what, Karl Marx, who predicted the withering away of the state in communism, but it's funny, Karl Marx, he's a genius, I'm not, so who am I to say? But Karl Marx anticipated the withering away of the state in communism, and, but, he didn't fully appreciate how capitalism would create its own entities. Global capitalism, which Marx understood and sort of predicted, has been much more resilient than he expected. In the 21st century, and you talk about this with your guests, right? These massive global companies uh, have a way of evading or being, at least becoming in many ways more powerful and more influential than nation states, than governments. So that is a very interesting new element, I would say, that the rules-based order after World War II didn't really anticipate. So this is part of, I started out in our conversation saying we're kind of an interregnum now between one rules-based order and another order of some kind. We can't really know. But what you're pointing out is an element, and it needs to be an element in our rethinking of the system. Because, just thinking about the big seven in the U.S. Equities market, um, those people have real power, and they are absolutely critical. Just think about the way that Elon Musk's satellite system has created an apparatus for Ukraine. I mean, not something that anybody, I think, seriously anticipated. So, yes, this is a very important new element of a rethinking of a new global order. The way that global corporatism, you might say, has shifted a dynamic from nation states. And that is, again, not something that we anticipated 80 years ago.
Dr. Moreno, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You have spent 4 decades in this field, advising presidents and international bodies. What was the specific moment or realization that made you stop and say, the old world is gone and I need to write the obituary or the survival guide for bioethics?
Yeah, what was the specific moment? Indeed, good question. Um, I'm not going to credit myself with too much foresight, so I want to be a little modest. But um, there were two things that happened in 2014 and 2015, and I actually did give a talk to the Bioethics Association of Mexico, which is a very well organized group in Mexico City at a conference. And I said, and I think people looked at me like there was something wrong with me, that the tectonic plates are shifting. This was back in 2014, 2014, I think it was. And that was the invasion of Ukraine. That was the first time since World War II that one sovereign state had attempted to annex territory of another sovereign state. That it was a big moment. And it just seemed to me that we had failed to understand exactly, to appreciate exactly how significant that was. Then in 2015, and this is when I was a member of the UNESCO Bioethics Committee, you have the drought in Syria, which led to this massive migration to southern Europe. Now, human beings are a migratory species, but whenever you have mass migration, you do have big social and political shifts. And it did seem to me that between the invasion, the annexation, attempted annexation of Ukraine, which we still don't know what's going to happen with that, and um, and the migration from the southern part of the world to the northern part of the world in a very sensitive area, Mediterranean, up into southern Europe and then northern Europe. Those were significant events. And I don't think we've completely come to terms with how important those moments were. And for me, again, not crediting myself with too much foresight, to me, it did feel like something was happening. And I couldn't, and then, of course, in 2016, you have the US election, President Trump, the first time. Uh, these were three very significant moments. And I think, anybody who was paying attention, not only me, but many others, saw that the old rules-based order was being threatened in a way that it was not the case ever in 75, 80 years.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan Moreno, for this rich and timely conversation and for helping us to see bioethics in a wider context for a changing global order. We are grateful for your insights and for the decades of work that make this discussion possible. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you have enjoyed this episode, please do not forget to buy a copy of Absolutely Essential. Thank you once again, Professor Jonathan Moreno, for joining us today and sharing your insights. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deepak. Really excellent questions.
Thank you.